The Winchester rifle felt heavier than it should have been in Sarah Mitchell's 12-year-old hands. Her father, James Mitchell, stood beside her on the ridge overlooking the endless Montana wilderness, his weathered face casting long shadows in the amber light of late afternoon. The wind carried the scent of pine and earth, and somewhere far below, a elk moved through the forest, unaware that its life hung in the balance of a child's trembling fingers. "Don't think about the gun," James whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Think about why you're holding it. Intention comes before action, always." Sarah nodded, though her mind was already spiraling into 1,000 small anxieties. She was too young. Her arms were too weak. The distance was too far. Her father seemed to read her thoughts as he always did. "Listen to me, daughter," he said, kneeling beside her. "Most people approach life like they approach shooting. They aim at everything and hit nothing. But the people who matter, the ones who change things, they pick one target and they don't stop until they hit it. Patience wins wars, not bullets." She understood then. This wasn't about hunting. This was about discipline. This was about becoming someone who could commit to something so completely that doubt became irrelevant. She exhaled slowly, pressed her cheek against the rifle stock and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked, the elk fell. From that moment forward, Sarah Mitchell was never going to be ordinary. 23 years later, Sarah walked into the Army recruitment office in Missoula with her father's words tattooed across her heart like a sacred scripture. The recruiter, a man with sergeant stripes and a thick neck, barely looked up from his desk. He was accustomed to desperate men looking for escape routes from poverty, running from crime, or fleeing broken homes. He was not accustomed to women who walked with the certainty of someone who'd already won 1,000 invisible battles. "What can I do for you, ma'am?" he asked, his tone suggesting he was expecting a donation inquiry or directions to the bathroom. "I want to join the Army," Sarah said simply. "I want to be a sniper." The sergeant's eyes actually left his computer screen. He studied her, the height average, the build lean but not extraordinary, the face pretty in an unremarkable way, marked only by striking gray eyes. What he was looking for, he would later admit to a friend, was any indication that this woman understood what she was asking for. Snipers were rare. Female soldiers were increasingly common. But female snipers, that was asking the institution to bend in ways it had not yet bent. "Do you have shooting experience?" he asked carefully. "Competitive shooting since I was 8, hunting since I was 12. I've maintained a rifle more times than I've maintained relationships," Sarah replied. She almost smiled at her own joke. Almost. The sergeant recruited her that day, but not because he believed in her. He recruited her because it was his job and he had a quota. He assumed she'd wash out in basic training like most candidates who lacked the correct Y chromosome. He was incorrect. Basic training at Fort Jackson was designed to break people. It was a systematic process of stripping away individuality, will, and self-preservation instinct, then rebuilding soldiers from the component parts. The drill sergeants screamed until their voices became hoarse, called recruits subhuman derogatory terms, and created situations of profound discomfort designed to test whether you would quit. Sarah didn't quit. On day 2, a sergeant, a woman named Valdez with arms like tree trunks, got directly in Sarah's face. "You're too small, you're too weak, you're too female, you are going to get people killed." Sarah's response was quiet, "Then teach me not to." Valdez blinked. She hadn't expected that. In her experience, weak people got defensive. They cried. They called their mothers. They looked for unfairness to blame their failures on. Sarah just looked patient. It was disconcerting. By week 4, Sarah was running the obstacle course in times that outmatched 60% of the men in her unit. By week 8, she was consistently the highest scorer in marksmanship. By week 12, she had earned something more valuable than the respect of her drill sergeants. She had earned their genuine belief that she belonged there. But respect from military trainers was one thing. Respect from the operational community was another entirely. When Sarah applied to the elite sniper school at Fort Benning, she included a letter of recommendation from her company commander that was so glowing it bordered on sarcasm. The selection committee received applications from 300 soldiers that year. 16 were invited to attend the course. 2 were rejected before it even began. 1 was a woman. That woman was not Sarah. The first day of selection, a master sergeant named Hayes, a man with the haunted eyes of someone who'd taken too many lives, addressed the candidates. "You're looking at each other right now, thinking about which of you will drop," he said. "Let me tell you, all of you will consider quitting. Most of you will actually do it. The ones who stay are the ones who have already decided they're dead." He paused. "Your names don't matter anymore. Your backgrounds don't matter. Your mothers don't matter. The only thing that matters is whether you will function when your mind is broken, and your body is screaming, and the enemy is trying to kill you." The course was 18 weeks of systematic destruction. Physical training so intense that 3 candidates quit within 48 hours. Classroom work on ballistics, physics, and advanced mathematics that made college calculus look like elementary school arithmetic. Live-fire exercises at distances that push the boundaries of human capability. And beneath it all, a constant, grinding pressure from instructors who seemed to view the entire operation as an exercise in finding excuses to recycle candidates, military speak for kicking them out. Sarah's hands blistered and bled from crawling through obstacle courses. Her shoulders developed stress fractures from carrying 120-pound ammunition packs up mountains. Her mind fractured into components: the calculating part, the patient part, the ruthless part, and the ghost that watched it all from a distance without judgment or mercy. By week 9, the attrition rate had climbed to 40%. Sarah stood in the top 5. The other 4 candidates were men who had, one by one, begun to acknowledge her presence, not as a woman infiltrating their world, but as a sniper. And in the sniper community, nothing else mattered. When Sarah graduated from sniper school, she was one of only 12 candidates from the original 16 who remained. She stood in dress uniform at the ceremony, watching Master Sergeant Hayes approach her with a medal and something that might have been pride in his eyes. "You're not thinking like a soldier," he told her quietly, pinning the medal to her chest. "You think like something else, something rarer. You're going to be dangerous." That night, Sarah called her father. "I did it, Dad," she said simply. On the other end of the line, she heard him breathe, not a sigh but something deeper: recognition. "You were always going to," he said. "Remember what I told you on the ridge. Patience wins wars, not bullets." "That's right, now go win yours." But winning in the military wasn't about marksmanship. It was about institutional acceptance. And the institution was still very much male, very much skeptical, and very much unprepared for a woman who would not apologize for her competence. The sniper community was small and tight-knit. The stories about the civilian woman who'd somehow infiltrated their ranks spread quickly. Some of the stories were true. Some were exaggerated. Some were pure fiction designed to break down her credibility before she could demonstrate her capability. One lieutenant called her into his office specifically to warn her that she'd made a mistake. "You'd be better suited to support roles," he said, his tone almost sympathetic. "No shame in that. The infantry isn't for everyone." Sarah looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a man terrified of irrelevance. The world was changing. Women were entering spaces that had been exclusively male for generations, and men like him were scrambling to figure out where they still mattered. "With respect, sir," she said, "I'm exactly where I belong, and I'm going to prove it every single day until everyone believes it." 3 years later, when she was promoted to staff sergeant and given command of a sniper team, that same lieutenant asked for her advice on operational planning. She gave it freely. They both knew she'd won. But she also knew the real battle hadn't started yet. The real battle was waiting in the desert, where snipers were born and remade into instruments of precision and will, Fort Benning, Georgia. The physical campus was unremarkable, endless rows of barracks, firing ranges stretching toward the horizon, and classrooms that hadn't been updated since the Cold War. But the psychological landscape was a different matter entirely. The sniper school at Fort Benning was where the human mind came to be systematically dismantled and rebuilt into something more disciplined, more focused, and more lethal than nature had intended. Sarah arrived on a Monday morning in August when the heat was thick enough to drink. The humidity wrapped around her like a living thing, making every breath feel like drowning slowly in warm soup. She wore dress uniform despite the weather, partly out of respect for the institution, and partly because she wanted to look sharp. Looking sharp meant looking like you belonged, and she needed to belong or she would break. Master Sergeant Jacob Hayes stood on the parade ground with arms crossed, watching the incoming class of candidates assemble in front of him. Hayes was a man in his early 50s with gray threading through his dark hair and eyes that had seen things he would spend the rest of his life trying to forget. He'd spent 23 years in the military. 14 of those years had been as an active sniper in 3 different wars. The math was simple. The man had killed more people than most soldiers would see in their entire careers. "Welcome to hell," Hayes said, his voice carrying across the assembled group without shouting. "You're looking at each other right now, making calculations. You're thinking about which of these candidates won't make it. Let me save you the time. Most of you won't make it. This isn't about physical capability. This isn't about shooting accuracy. This is about your ability to function when your mind is screaming and your body is broken and death is knocking on every door." He paced in front of them, his boots clicking against the asphalt. "A sniper operates alone. No backup, no air support you can see, no fellow infantry to lay covering fire. You are a ghost, and ghosts operate in spaces where normal humans cannot survive psychologically. The question is, can you survive psychologically?" Sarah felt her heart rate accelerate. This was real now. This was no longer theory or preparation. This was the actual beginning. Week 1 was a methodical assault on the physical body. The candidates, 14 men and 1 woman, were woken at 04:30 every morning by Hayes personally entering the barracks and revering a trash can with a tremendous metal clang. 4 hours of physical training followed, running with full combat load, crawling through mud and water obstacles, carrying ammunition cans up mountains and back down again. Sarah's hands blistered by day 3. By day 5, the blisters had calloused over into something harder and less sensitive. One candidate, a large man named Henderson who'd been consistently friendly to Sarah, quit on day 6. He'd approached Hayes with tears in his eyes and simply said he couldn't do it. Hayes nodded without judgment and processed his withdrawal paperwork that afternoon. The remaining 13 candidates watched him leave and understood the unspoken message. This institution would not judge them for quitting, but it would absolutely judge them for staying if they weren't committed. Sarah stayed. Week 3 brought the classroom component. If physical training was an assault on the body, this was an assault on the intellect. The ballistics course made calculus look like elementary mathematics. The candidates had to learn the physics of projectile motion at ranges that existed in the theoretical margins of possibility. Wind speed, atmospheric pressure, humidity, temperature, angle of fire, the Coriolis effect. The rotation of the Earth itself became a factor at extreme range. Master Sergeant Hayes taught most of the classes himself. He stood at the front of the classroom with a laser pointer and a seemingly infinite patience for questions. "A rifle bullet in a vacuum would travel forever," he explained, drawing a straight line across the projected slide. "But we don't live in a vacuum. We live in an atmosphere. The bullet experiences gravity, air resistance, and 1,000 environmental variables from the second it leaves the muzzle. At 1,000 meters, a 2-mile-per-hour wind that you can barely feel can shift your bullet impact by 3 inches. At 2,000 meters, it can shift it by 3 feet. So the question becomes, how do we calculate for variables we cannot see, cannot predict perfectly, and cannot control?" Sarah raised her hand. We gather data and make educated predictions based on observable patterns, she said. Hayes smiled, actually smiled, which seemed to surprise everyone in the classroom. Exactly, you're not thinking like a shooter, you're thinking like a scientist. That's the first sign you might actually survive this. By week 7, the candidates had been reduced to 9. A man named Rodriguez, who would later become Sarah's actual spotter in the field, had impressed everyone by calculating a 1,000-yard shot in his head with 95% accuracy. A quiet man named Okafor from Detroit had demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to read wind and adjust for it instinctively. And Sarah had started demonstrating something that Hayes recognized as rarer. She'd started to disappear. Not physically, obviously, but psychologically she'd begun the process of compartmentalization that separated normal humans from elite snipers. She could sit in a hide, a small, concealed position, for 14 hours without moving. She could breathe at a rate of 1 breath per minute, maintaining the stillness required for precision shooting. She could quiet the part of her mind that wanted to fidget, wanted to adjust position, wanted to do anything except remain perfectly still. "You're not thinking like a soldier," Hayes told her one evening, pulling her aside after a training exercise. "You're thinking like something else, something rarer. You're becoming a ghost. Ghosts don't move unless they choose to. Ghosts don't speak unless they choose to. Ghosts exist in the spaces between things." Sarah met his eyes. "Is that a compliment or a warning?" "Both," Hayes said. "The best snipers I've known were also the most dangerous humans I've ever met, not because they were particularly violent or sadistic, but because they'd learned to separate the action from the consequence. They could pull a trigger and not feel the recoil. Do you understand what I'm saying?" "You're saying I need to become someone I'm not sure I want to be." Hayes nodded slowly. "I'm saying that between this room and the room where you make the actual kill, you have to become someone different. And the hard part, the really hard part, is going back. Can you go back to being Sarah Mitchell after you've been the ghost?" Sarah considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "If the alternative is staying the ghost forever, I'll find a way to go back." Hayes seemed satisfied with that answer. He squeezed her shoulder, the most human gesture she'd seen from him, and walked away. Week 9 brought live fire exercises at extreme range. The range at Fort Benning extended to 2,000 meters, a distance most soldiers would never shoot in their entire careers. Sarah positioned herself in a prone position on a hill overlooking the range, her rifle sighted on targets that looked like dots from where she lay. The conditions were brutal, wind gusting unpredictably, humidity affecting air density, the heat rising in visible waves off the ground. Her spotter, Rodriguez, confirmed now as her permanent partner, whispered adjustments. 3 o'clock wind 12 knots, adjust 2.4 mil. Sarah's breathing had slowed to 1 breath per minute. Her heart rate hovered around 40 beats per minute, slower than it would be at complete rest, but that wasn't possible. She was in a state that wasn't quite sleep and wasn't quite consciousness. She was in the space between. She fired. The target at 2,000 meters exploded with a hit directly in the center. Rodriguez breathed out slowly. "Holy shit," he whispered. Sarah didn't respond. She simply worked the bolt, chambered another round, and waited for the next target. The ghost didn't celebrate victories. The ghost didn't experience emotion about what it had done. The ghost simply existed in the moment of the next shot and the one after that. When the exercise concluded 18 hours later, Sarah had achieved a 97% hit rate at ranges most snipers would consider impossible. Master Sergeant Hayes reviewed the data that evening and simply nodded. He didn't need to say anything. The data spoke for itself. Sarah Mitchell wasn't just going to graduate from sniper school. She was going to change what was possible. The C-130 Hercules descended through clouds that looked like smoke, and Sarah Mitchell's stomach executed a small flip that had nothing to do with the turbulence. Below her, visible now in patches through the break in the clouds, was Afghanistan. The Hindu Kush mountains rose like broken teeth against a sky the color of bleached bone. Even from 30,000 feet, the landscape looked hostile, all rock and dust and emptiness, the kind of place where human life seemed like an afterthought to geology. The plane touched down on the airstrip at Bagram with a jolt that threw everyone forward slightly in their seats. The noise was deafening, the reverse thrust of the engines, the screech of hydraulics, the sound of a multi-billion-dollar piece of military hardware settling onto tarmac that had seen 1,000 flights just like this one. Sarah grabbed her gear bag and stood, moving into the aisle with the trained efficiency of someone who'd done this before. Except she hadn't. This was her first actual deployment. Everything before this had been preparation. The heat hit her like a physical force when the cargo ramp lowered. Dry heat, the kind that pulled moisture from your mouth and eyes within seconds. The smell was unfamiliar, a mixture of dust, diesel fuel, and something else. Something she would later learn to recognize as the smell of a military base in a war zone, machinery, sweat, and the faint metallic tang of weapon oil. Her team was waiting by the vehicles, a cluster of soldiers in tan and green, scanning the airfield with the practiced vigilance of people who'd been here long enough to know that nowhere was entirely safe. Captain Richard Morrison was the first to approach her. He was a man in his late 30s with the kind of weathered face that suggested either excellent genetics or significant stress, probably both. His handshake was firm but not aggressive, and his eyes assessed her without judgment. "Staff Sergeant Mitchell," he said, "welcome to Forward Operating Base Wolverine. We've been expecting you." "Thank you, sir," Sarah replied, gripping her gear bag a little tighter. "Come on," Morrison said, gesturing toward the vehicles. "We'll get you settled, and then we need to talk about your role here." The convoy drive to FOB Wolverine took 40 minutes through terrain that grew progressively more hostile. The valley they traveled through was narrow and steep-sided, exactly the kind of geography that made ambush easy and escape difficult. Sarah noticed the gunners in the turrets scanning the ridgelines with professional attention. Every vehicle maintained distance from the one in front, a tactical spacing that would minimize casualties if the lead vehicle hit an IED. Everything about this operation was calculated, controlled, focused on surviving what might come. The compound itself was unimpressive. Concrete walls topped with razor wire, a cluster of single-story buildings made of prefabricated steel, guard towers at each corner. It wasn't much, but it was defensible. The American flag hung limply from a pole near the main entrance, the only splash of color in an otherwise drab landscape of browns and tans. That evening, Captain Morrison briefed her in his office, a small room with a desk, a cot, and maps covering every available wall space. The maps showed the surrounding region marked with circles, lines, and annotations in red and blue, red for enemy positions, blue for friendly. Sarah studied them, memorizing the geography, the villages, the routes. "We're not here to kill everyone," Morrison said, settling into his chair. "I know that might sound strange coming from a military commander, but it's true. Killing creates more enemies. What we're here to do is gather intelligence, understand the patterns, predict where conflicts are going to happen, and then we prevent them, not with bullets but with information. Foreknowledge is the most valuable weapon we have." Sarah nodded, understanding what he was really saying. Her role wasn't to be a trigger puller. Her role was to be the eyes and ears of the operation. "Your spotter, Rodriguez, arrived yesterday," Morrison continued. "He's been attached to the 75th Ranger Regiment for 3 years. He's solid. You two will form the reconnaissance and interdiction team. You'll go out, establish observation posts, monitor key locations, and report back. No independent action. No trigger pulls without direct authorization. You're not here to be a weapon. You're here to be intelligence." "Understood, sir," Sarah said. "Any questions?" Sarah had many questions. She had questions about the people they'd be observing. She had questions about what happened to the intelligence after she reported it. She had questions about the moral weight of knowing something was going to happen and then watching it happen anyway. But what she said was, "Just one, sir. What's the timeline?" Morrison smiled faintly. "Welcome to war. There is no timeline. We move when opportunities emerge. Be ready to move at any time." The compound had a rhythm Sarah discovered in her first week. Morning prayers from the nearby village drifted across the valley around 05:00 and again around 17:00. Supply convoys came through on Tuesdays and Saturdays. The local population moved through established patterns, farmers working the terraced fields, children going to the schoolhouse, men gathering at a small market at the village center. Each of these patterns could change with a single ambush, a single IED, a single moment of violence that would ripple outward and alter the entire landscape. Her team was small: herself, Rodriguez as spotter, and two enlisted soldiers, Martinez and Jackson, who handled logistics and communication. They spent their days studying the terrain, preparing observation posts, running exercises to ensure they could move quickly and silently across the mountains. Rodriguez proved to be exactly as advertised: competent, professional, and remarkably calm under pressure. One evening, she couldn't sleep. The compound was quiet except for the ever-present sound of the generators that powered the camp. She climbed to the roof and found Rodriguez already there, sitting with his back against a wall, staring out at the dark landscape. "Can't sleep either?" he asked. "Thinking too much," Sarah admitted. "About what?" "About why we're here. About what happens if we're good at our job versus if we're bad at it. About the people down there in those villages who have no idea that we're watching them." Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment. "My grandfather," he said finally, "was a hunter, real old school. He told me once that the difference between a hunter and a murderer is intention. A hunter kills to preserve life, his own, his family's. A murderer kills because he's broken something inside himself. We're hunters, Sergeant. We're here to preserve lives. The intelligence we gather, the positions we identify, the patterns we understand, that all goes toward preventing attacks. We're not here to murder people. We're here to stop them before they become the enemy." Sarah wanted to believe that. She needed to believe that. "Do you believe that?" she asked. "Every morning," Rodriguez said, "and every night I have to remind myself." Below them in the darkness, the village lay quiet. Somewhere down there, people were sleeping, going about their lives, unaware that American soldiers were watching them, studying them, waiting. The weight of that observation pressed down on Sarah like a physical thing. Tomorrow she would begin the real work. Tomorrow she would move into the mountains and establish her first observation post. Tomorrow she would become the ghost that Master Sergeant Hayes had promised she would become. But tonight, she just sat with Rodriguez and tried to remember why that was necessary. Week 6 of Sarah's deployment, she and Rodriguez established a permanent observation post on a ridge overlooking a compound approximately 3 kilometers from their position. The compound was unremarkable: gray concrete walls, several buildings inside, vehicles parked haphazardly in a courtyard. To most people, it would have looked like any of a dozen other structures in the valley. But Captain Morrison had specifically directed them here, which meant intelligence community somewhere up the chain had flagged it as significant. The observation post itself was barely more than a shallow depression in the rocky ground, covered by a camouflage net that broke up their thermal signature and visual profile. Sarah and Rodriguez had spent 2 days positioning it, removing loose rocks, creating firing lanes, and establishing 200 meters of concealment between them and the compound. The work was meticulous and exhausting. Once they settled in, the real work began: watching. Sarah's eyes were fixed on the compound through her spotting scope. Rodriguez sat beside her with a notebook, recording everything: times, descriptions, patterns, anomalies. The morning prayer call came from the village below, and at almost exactly that moment, a man emerged from the main building. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a beard that had gone gray at the edges. Even at 3 kilometers distance, there was something about him that commanded attention. The way he moved suggested authority. The way the other men around him deferred suggested respect, or possibly fear. "That's him," Rodriguez whispered, though there was no one within earshot. "That's got to be Razik." Sarah didn't respond. She was already recording the time, 07:03, and making mental notes about his appearance. Tall male, approximately 45 to 50 years old, gray-streaked beard, dark clothing. The description was clinical. The ghost didn't assign emotional weight to observations. That afternoon, Captain Morrison visited their observation post with a tablet displaying satellite imagery and a file folder that Sarah wasn't supposed to see. But Morrison let her see it anyway, which meant he wanted her to understand the scope of what she was observing. Commander Malik Razik. That was the name attached to the photographs and intelligence summaries. Razik had been coordinating coordinated attacks on coalition forces for 3 years. The intelligence file showed a pattern. Every attack he orchestrated resulted in 5 to 10 American casualties, sometimes more. His cells were organized, disciplined, and effective. He was the kind of enemy that appeared in quarterly briefings to Pentagon brass because stopping him would genuinely save lives. "This is Lieutenant James Connor," Morrison said, pointing to a photograph in the file. Sarah felt something tighten in her chest. Connor was young, maybe 23, with an easy smile and eyes that hadn't yet learned to fear. 3rd Platoon, Bravo Company, died in an ambush 6 months ago. Razik coordinated that attack. 3 other soldiers died with him. Connor was from Ohio. He had a wife named Michelle and a daughter, Abigail, who was born 3 months after he died. Michelle's never going to see her daughter grow up with her father. Morrison closed the folder deliberately. "I'm not telling you this to pressure you. I'm telling you this so you understand what's at stake. Razik doesn't operate alone. He has a network. We need to understand that network before we move against him. That's your job, understand. Document, report." "And then?" Sarah asked. "Then command makes decisions," Morrison said. "That's not your job." The weeks that followed were a study in patience and precision. Sarah and Rodriguez maintained the observation post continuously, with 2-day rotations back to the FOB for resupply and rest. They documented every movement Razik made. The man was disciplined and predictable, possibly too predictable, which made Sarah wonder if he was being careful or simply confident in his position. Razik prayed at the mosque in the village every Friday morning at 06:00. He held strategy meetings in the compound courtyard every Sunday and Wednesday at 14:30. Supply convoys arrived on the 1st and 3rd Tuesday of each month, always at 09:00. He met with local elders on Thursdays at 17:00. His daily routine had the precision of a man who understood that structure meant survival, or possibly a man who was simply confident enough not to worry about security. Sarah also documented the men around him. There was his deputy, a thin man with a scarred face who moved with the controlled precision of a trained fighter. There were bodyguards, at least 4, possibly 6, who rotated through the compound. There were civilian associates whose function was less clear, possibly money handlers, possibly recruiters, possibly intelligence officers. She drew detailed maps showing guard positions, vehicle locations, sight lines, and firing angles. Her notebooks filled with observations, weather patterns, wind directions, times when the compound was most and least populated. She noted the vehicles: a white Toyota truck, a black sedan, a military-grade Humvee that Razik seemed to use for transport. Rodriguez worked with CIA analysts via secure communications, passing along photographs and observations. The analysts built a profile of Razik's network, mapping the connections, identifying key players, establishing patterns of movement and communication. Slowly, a picture emerged of an organization that was not just violent but systematic. Every attack was coordinated weeks in advance. Every operation had objectives. This wasn't random terrorism. It was warfare conducted by someone with military training and operational discipline. Week 9 of surveillance, Sarah's patience was tested in a way she hadn't anticipated. A convoy came through the valley, American soldiers, part of a patrol out of Shkin. Sarah watched through her scope as they moved down the road, unaware that 3 kilometers away, she could see them, track them, follow their progress with absolute certainty. She also watched as 2 men emerged from the compound and began watching the patrol with what looked like calculating interest. "Contact at the compound," she whispered to Rodriguez. "2 males on the roof. They're tracking the patrol visually." Rodriguez was already on the radio. "Wolverine, this is Shadow 1. We have eyes on compound. 2 potential hostile actors appearing to plot against Convoy Alpha 7 on Highway 6. The response came back almost immediately. Convoy Alpha 7 was diverted, taking an alternate route that avoided the area. No engagement occurred. The 2 men on the roof lost visual contact and eventually disappeared back inside the compound. Later that evening, in their debrief with Captain Morrison, the intelligence came through. A cell phone associated with one of those men had been attempting to reach another cell phone approximately 2 kilometers north of the convoy's original route. That second phone had been carried by a man identified as a known ambush coordinator. The diversion had prevented an attack that would likely have killed at least 5 soldiers. Sarah's observation had prevented deaths. She felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and horror at that realization. "This is what we're doing," Morrison said quietly. "This is what intelligence saves, not the big operations, the small ones, the ones people never hear about because they never happened." The message came through secure communications at 14:30 on a Thursday. The operation was scheduled for the following night. Sarah received it in the company operations center, read it once, and then excused herself to walk the perimeter of the fob alone. She needed space. She needed to process what she'd known intellectually for weeks but had never allowed herself to fully confront. Tomorrow, she was going to kill a man. That evening, she returned to her bunk and pulled out the folder Morrison had shown her. Lieutenant James Connor's photograph stared back at her, that easy smile, those young eyes. She opened her laptop and searched through the digital files until she found the photograph he'd mentioned. Michelle Connor, standing in front of a hospital room, holding a newborn daughter, Abigail, the little girl who would grow up without knowing her father. Sarah printed the photographs and taped them to the wall above her bunk. Then she sat and looked at them for a long time. The doubt came in waves, like nausea. Who was she to make this decision? What if the intelligence was wrong? What if Razik was actually something other than what they believed? What if he was simply defending his homeland from invaders, and she was about to become an assassin for the occupying military? What if the intelligence community had gotten it wrong, and she was about to kill an innocent man? These thoughts had no answers. Doubt, she was learning, was not something that could be resolved through logic. Doubt was something you had to accept, acknowledge, and then move past. She pulled out her rifle from the gun safe and began the process of field stripping it. Each component, the bolt, the firing pin, the magazine, the stock, came apart in her hands. She'd performed this ritual hundreds of times. The muscle memory was so ingrained that her hands could do it in complete darkness. But tonight, she slowed down deliberately, examining each piece, cleaning it with deliberate care, understanding that this weapon had become an extension of herself in a way that was both comforting and terrifying. The barrel was pristine. Chronograph testing had confirmed it maintained sub-MOA accuracy out to 3,000 meters. The scope was perfectly sighted. The magazine had been loaded with the specific ammunition they'd selected based on ballistic calculations for the range and environmental conditions. Everything was perfect because perfection was the only acceptable standard. Around midnight, unable to sleep, Sarah climbed to the roof where she and Rodriguez often found refuge in the darkness. She expected to find it empty. Instead, Rodriguez was already there, sitting with his back against the wall, staring at the mountains that were barely visible in the starlight. "Can't sleep?" he asked without turning to look at her. "Thinking too much," Sarah admitted, settling beside him. "About what?" The question hung in the darkness for a moment. "About why I'm here, about whether I should be here, about what happens after." Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment. "You want to know something I've never told anyone," he said finally. "The night before my first operation, and I mean the operation where I actually fired my weapon with the intent to kill someone, not training exercises, I threw up. Repeatedly. I was sure I was going to fail. I was sure I wasn't capable of what I was being asked to do." "What changed?" "Nothing changed," Rodriguez said. "I was still terrified, but I did it anyway. And then the next time was slightly less terrifying. And the time after that was slightly less terrifying still. But I want you to know that the day I stop being terrified before I take a life is the day I become something I don't want to become." Sarah absorbed that. "Are you terrified right now?" "Absolutely," Rodriguez said. "I'm terrified that I'll misjudge the wind. I'm terrified that you'll have to adjust for something I didn't account for. I'm terrified that we'll miss, and Razik will survive, and the next soldiers who die in his next ambush will have died partially because of our failure. But I'm going to get up tomorrow and do this anyway, because the alternative is knowing that I could have prevented those deaths and didn't." They sat in silence for a long time. Below them, the compound was dark. Razik was sleeping, unaware that his life was being counted down in hours. Somewhere, Michelle Connor was probably putting her daughter to bed. Somewhere, soldiers were sleeping in barracks, completely unaware that their lives were about to change because of decisions made in the darkness. Sarah returned to her bunk and tried to sleep, but her mind wouldn't quiet. She found herself thinking about her father, the man who'd first placed a rifle in her hands and told her that patience wins wars. What would he think of her now? Would he be proud, or would he see what she was becoming and mourn the daughter he'd raised? She pulled out her phone and called him. It was 01:30 in the morning in Georgia, which meant it was 18:30 in Montana. He answered on the second ring, already alert. Military families developed the ability to wake instantly when a phone call came at odd hours. "Sarah, what's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong, Dad," she said quickly. I needed to hear your voice." She could hear him settling into his chair. "Talk to me, kiddo." "Do you ever think about the animals you've killed?" she asked. There was a pause. Her father had been a careful man about violence. He hunted for sustenance, never for sport. He'd never killed anything he didn't plan to eat. "Sometimes," he admitted, "especially the ones that were harder shots, the ones that made me work for it." "Why?" "Just wondering if you ever had doubts, if you ever wondered if you were, I don't know, wrong about something, if there was another way." Her father was quiet for a long moment. "Sarah, every person who's ever taken a life, whether that life was a deer or a man, has had those doubts. The ones who don't have doubts are monsters. The ones who have doubts and do it anyway are soldiers. Which one do you want to be?" "I don't want to be either," Sarah whispered. "I know," her father said, "but sometimes we don't get to choose. Sometimes we just get to choose how we carry it." After she hung up, Sarah lay in her bunk and stared at the photographs of Michelle and Abigail Connor. She thought about all the decisions that had led to this moment. Her father teaching her patience on a Montana ridge, her application to sniper school, the 18 weeks of training, the months of surveillance, the intelligence reports, the coordinated planning by dozens of people across multiple agencies and military units. All of it had converged into a single moment that hadn't happened yet. She wasn't a monster. She was a woman who'd been trained to do something most people couldn't do. She'd been prepared, positioned, and authorized to take an action that would prevent future deaths. That was what she had to hold onto when the doubt came. That was the framework that would allow her to function when her humanity screamed at her to refuse. Around 04:00, she gave up on sleep entirely. She rose and went to the armory where she spent 2 hours breaking down and reassembling her rifle, checking and rechecking every component, confirming that everything was perfect. The ritual was meditative. By the time she was done, her breathing had slowed. Her hands were steady. The ghost had emerged from beneath the human skin, ready for what needed to be done. The sun rose over the Hindu Kush mountains, brilliant and merciless. Sarah watched it come up, knowing that when it set, everything would be different. The night was cold, below freezing, which affected air density and therefore bullet trajectory. Sarah and Rodriguez moved across the rocky terrain in complete darkness, using only starlight to navigate. They'd rehearsed this route 100 times in their minds, but actually executing it was different. Each footstep was carefully placed, each movement deliberate and controlled. Speed meant nothing. Silence meant everything. The new position was 2 kilometers from the compound, approximately northwest of Razik's location. It had taken 3 days of reconnaissance to identify it, a rocky ridge that provided excellent elevation advantage and distance while maintaining complete concealment. From this position, the shot distance would be 2,847 meters. At that distance, the bullet would be in flight for over 4 seconds. During those 4 seconds, gravity, wind, humidity, temperature, and atmospheric pressure would all conspire to alter the bullet's path. It took 90 minutes to cover 2 kilometers. When they finally reached the position, Sarah's heart rate was elevated, her breathing controlled but deeper than normal. Rodriguez laid out the shooting mat, a camouflaged piece of equipment that would provide insulation from the cold ground and a stable platform for the rifle. Sarah positioned herself prone, the rifle settling into her shoulder with the familiarity of 10,000 practice rounds. The spotting scope came up to Rodriguez's eye. He was already gathering environmental data, wind speed, direction, temperature, humidity. His voice was barely a whisper. Conditions are marginal. Wind is variable, gusting from 3 to 15 knots. Temperature dropping, which means air density is increasing. That will help us. The range to target is confirmed at 2,847 meters. Sarah was already inputting data into her ballistic computer, a small handheld device that calculated for all the variables: wind speed, air density, distance, angle of fire. The computer crunched the numbers and displayed the shooting solution. Aim 0.4.7 mils high, 1.2 mils right. She dialed those adjustments into her rifle scope. "Ready," Rodriguez whispered. "Ready," Sarah confirmed. They settled into a wait that was completely different from any previous operation. This wasn't surveillance. This was execution. Somewhere below them, Razik was going about his evening, completely unaware that a 7.62 round traveling at 2,800 meters per second was being aimed at his position. The night stretched. The minutes felt like hours. Sarah's breathing had slowed to the meditation-like state she'd learned in training, 1 breath per minute, perfectly controlled, her heart rate dropping to 50 beats per minute. At this level of control, she could feel each individual heartbeat in her chest. "Wind gusting again," Rodriguez whispered. "Still variable. Recommend we wait for it to stabilize." Sarah didn't respond. Patience. Always patience. Master Sergeant Hayes' voice echoed in her memory. Impatience kills more snipers than bad marksmanship. 02:13. Still no target. 02:47. Razik's schedule. This was the time window where he'd be most likely to emerge from the compound. Sarah's scope was positioned on the compound entrance. Rodriguez had confirmed the angle, the distance, the sight picture. Everything was as perfect as it could be made. Then the compound lights flickered. Movement. The door to the main building opened. "Target," Rodriguez whispered. Razik emerged, silhouetted against the compound lights. He was conferring with 2 of his lieutenants, their voices carrying faintly up the mountain, far too distant to hear words, but the cadence suggested operational discussion. This was typical. Razik often moved to the courtyard to conduct meetings, possibly because he believed the open air made him harder to target. He was wrong. Sarah's scope tracked him, the crosshairs centered on his chest. Her breathing remained perfectly controlled, 1 breath per minute. Her finger rested against the trigger, not yet applying pressure, just positioning. "Wind is stabilizing," Rodriguez whispered. "Recommend 3-knot adjustment. Current wind is 11 knots from 2 o'clock position." Sarah made the micro adjustment to her scope. The distance was so extreme that miscalculating wind speed by even 2 knots could cause a complete miss. At this range, a miss wasn't just tactical failure. A miss meant Razik would disappear. The intelligence network would collapse into chaos and reorganization, and American soldiers would die in future ambushes because she'd failed to complete this shot. The pressure was absolute. Razik turned slightly. The conversation continued. The lieutenants gestured, pointing toward the mountains, toward the road where convoys moved. Sarah understood what she was seeing. He was planning future attacks. This was an operational planning meeting. This was evil in its most concrete form. She began applying pressure to the trigger. Not the full pressure needed to fire, but enough to remove the slack. The trigger had been precisely adjusted during training to require exactly 2.5 pounds of pressure. Her finger applied 2.3 pounds. The wind gusted again. Rodriguez immediately called out, "Wind surge, hold fire." Sarah stopped. Her finger remained at 2.3 pounds of pressure, poised in that terrible space between potential action and inaction. The wind stabilized. The minutes stretched. 02:51. Razik started to move, heading back toward the building. "Target's leaving," Rodriguez said, his voice tight. "You have maybe 10 seconds." This was the moment. The window was closing. In 10 seconds, Razik would be inside, concealed by walls and concrete, and the opportunity would evaporate. All of this, the weeks of surveillance, the intelligence gathering, the months of preparation, would be wasted if she missed or hesitated. Sarah's breathing never changed, 1 breath per minute. Her heart rate was exactly 50 beats per minute. Her mind was perfectly calm. The ghost was in complete control now. The human Sarah Mitchell had receded completely, leaving only the instrument. "Wind is steady," Rodriguez whispered. 4 knots holding steady. Razik paused, talking to one of the lieutenants about something. His body was perpendicular to her position now, side profile, the worst possible angle for an accurate shot because the body profile was narrowest. But it was also the angle that happened to put his heart directly in line with his spine, maximizing catastrophic organ damage. Sarah's finger applied the final 0.2 pounds of pressure. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, a recoil she barely felt, so completely dissociated was she from her body. The sound was a thunderclap that echoed across the mountains, announcing to the world that someone had just fired a weapon at an impossible distance. Through her scope, Sarah watched the impact. Razik's body jerked violently as if struck by an invisible force. The lieutenant beside him shouted. She could hear it faintly from 2 kilometers away. Razik collapsed. For a moment that stretched like eternity, no one moved. Then chaos erupted. Bodyguards emerged from the building. Lights illuminated the courtyard. Men shouted. Vehicles started. "Target down," Rodriguez said, his voice tight with adrenaline. "Confirmed impact. Target is not moving." Sarah was already working the bolt, chambering another round. The ghost didn't celebrate. The ghost prepared for contingencies. If Razik had survived, she would fire again. If bodyguards tried to move him, she would adjust fire. Professional completeness. But Razik didn't move. The intelligence that came over the radio 30 seconds later confirmed what they already knew. The target was dead. The round had entered at 2,847 meters and performed exactly as designed. Through the body armor, through the chest, causing massive internal trauma. Clinical. Perfect. Completely devastating. "We need to move," Rodriguez said. "They'll be launching search operations within minutes." Sarah secured her rifle and began moving back across the rocks, the same careful precision that had brought her there. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. The ghost had completed its purpose. Behind them, the compound descended into chaos. Razik's empire was already fragmenting, his lieutenants scrambling to understand what had happened, where the shot had come from, who was responsible. But Sarah and Rodriguez were ghosts. By the time anyone thought to search the rocky ridge, they would be kilometers away, absorbed back into the darkness. The impossible shot had been fired. The outcome that would save American lives had been secured. And Sarah Mitchell, now and forever, carried the weight of that one moment of compressed perfection. The extraction took 4 hours. Sarah and Rodriguez moved through darkness with the same precision they'd used to approach, but everything was different now. The weight was different. The silence was different. The ghost that had pulled the trigger was beginning to dissipate, and the human beneath was starting to reassert itself. By the time they reached Fob Wolverine, dawn was breaking. Captain Morrison was waiting in the operations center with a cup of coffee that steamed in the cold morning air. The intelligence reports were already coming in, fragments, initial assessments, confirmations. "Commander Razik is confirmed dead," Morrison said, not quite smiling. "Massive trauma to the chest cavity. The round went through body armor like it wasn't there. Intelligence community is picking up significant signal traffic. His organization is in complete disarray. 3 of his known lieutenants have already begun positioning against each other for succession. It's exactly what we hoped would happen. Leadership vacuum, organizational chaos, operational capability severely degraded." Sarah nodded, understanding the tactical victory. Her shot had achieved its objective. The intelligence community was already calculating prevented attacks. At least 3 planned operations that would have been coordinated by Razik were now canceled or postponed indefinitely. Conservative estimates suggested that her shot would prevent between 5 and 30 American deaths in the next 6 months. She was a hero. That's what the military would eventually call her. That's what the media would call her. But in the operations center, with Morrison looking at her with something like gratitude, all Sarah felt was hollow. That afternoon, exhausted beyond measure, she returned to her bunk and lay down fully clothed. Sleep didn't come. Instead, images replayed in her mind with perfect clarity, Razik's body jerking at the impact, the confusion on his lieutenants' faces, the light slowly leaving his eyes as he collapsed. She'd watched a man die through her scope. She'd been the instrument of his death. The rationalization was easy. Razik had killed American soldiers. Razik had coordinated attacks on civilians. Razik had been a legitimate military target authorized by command. The shot had been legal, justified, and necessary. Intellectually, Sarah understood all of this. But her nightmares didn't care about intellectual justification. She started waking at 03:00 every morning, drenched in sweat, with the sound of the rifle shot echoing in her ears. She started having difficulty eating. Food would sit in her stomach like stone. She noticed that loud noises made her jump, and that she'd become hyper-aware of her surroundings in a way that bordered on paranoia. Rodriguez noticed. He pulled her aside after a training exercise 3 days after the shot. "You're not sleeping," he said. "It wasn't a question." "I'm fine," Sarah replied. "You're lying," Rodriguez said. "Which is fine. Everyone lies about this. But you should know that what you're experiencing is normal. What you did was necessary, but it was also fundamentally abnormal. Your mind is trying to process something that human minds aren't really designed to process." "How do you live with it?" Sarah asked. Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment. "You don't. You learn to compartmentalize. You accept that there's a part of you that will carry this forever. You find people who understand, usually other people who have done the same thing, and you remind yourself every single day why it was necessary." A week after the shot, Captain Morrison called her into his office. He had a satellite phone and a somber expression. "There's someone who wants to talk to you," he said, handing her the phone. Michelle Connor's voice was shaky on the other end. "Staff Sergeant Mitchell, this is Michelle Connor. I'm Lieutenant James Connor's wife." Sarah's stomach tightened. This was exactly what she'd been dreading. "Mrs. Connor," she said carefully. "I wanted to thank you," Michelle said, and Sarah could hear tears in her voice. "I learned that the man who killed my husband is dead, that you're the one who did that. I want you to know that his death meant something, that his daughter, our daughter, she's going to grow up knowing that there are people who hold the line, who protect us, who make sure that what happened to James doesn't keep happening." Sarah couldn't speak. Tears were streaming down her face and she couldn't explain why. She'd saved this woman from future pain. She'd avenged her husband. She'd done something objectively good. So why did it feel like she was dying? "Thank you," Michelle continued. "Whatever you did, whatever you sacrificed to do it, thank you. Abigail will know your name. She'll know that you loved your country enough to do this." After the call ended, Sarah sat alone in the operations center and wept. She wept for Razik, the man she'd killed, who'd certainly had a family somewhere grieving his death. She wept for the American soldiers who died before she arrived, whose deaths couldn't be undone. She wept for Michelle Connor and the daughter who would grow up with an absent father. She wept for the person she'd been before the shot and the person she would never be again. 2 weeks after the operation, she was standing on the roof with Rodriguez when he asked her the question that cut to the heart of everything. "Do you regret it?" Sarah considered lying. She considered claiming that she didn't, that the mission had been righteous and the outcome justified. But Rodriguez had been honest with her, and she owed him the same honesty. "Every single day," she said. "And would you do it again?" "Tomorrow," Sarah replied. "If it needed to be done, I would do it tomorrow, but I would regret it just as much." Rodriguez nodded. He understood. That contradiction, loving your country enough to kill for it and hating yourself for needing to do it, was the core of what it meant to be a sniper. It was the razor's edge between being human and being a weapon, and most snipers spent their entire careers trying to find balance on that edge without falling off completely. The final week of her deployment, Sarah received new orders. She was being sent back to Fort Benning to work as an instructor. She would teach the next generation of snipers the skills that had allowed her to make an impossible shot. She would pass on everything she'd learned, everything she'd survived. The night before she left Fob Wolverine, she climbed to the roof one last time. The mountains were outlined against a star-filled sky. Somewhere down there, in a compound that was now occupied by different men, Razik's successors fighting each other for control, someone was probably making plans. Plans that would get American soldiers killed if no one stopped them. But that would be someone else's responsibility now. Sarah's responsibility was moving forward, carrying the weight, and finding a way to turn the darkness into something that could help others survive what she had survived. She thought about her father's words, "Remember what I told you on the ridge. Patience wins wars, not bullets." But she understood now that patience also won something else. It won the right to look people in the eye and say that you'd done what was necessary, even though it cost you something you could never get back. She would carry that cost for the rest of her life, and somehow she would find a way to make it mean something. 3 years later, Staff Sergeant Sarah Mitchell stood in front of a classroom at Fort Benning with 16 recruits assembled before her. The classroom was the same one where Master Sergeant Hayes had told them all that they were in hell. The cycle had completed itself in a way that Sarah found both comforting and unsettling. She was no longer the student. She was now the teacher. She was now the voice that would shape these soldiers into instruments of precision and will. The media had called her the Phantom, the legendary female sniper who made an impossible 2,847-meter shot that saved American lives and destabilized a terrorist organization. Magazine profiles had been written. News outlets had requested interviews. She'd been offered book deals and speaking engagements. The Army had promoted her and given her a commendation medal. None of it felt real. None of it changed anything. What was real was this: a young woman in the third row, maybe 24 years old, with hungry eyes and the posture of someone who was accustomed to proving themselves, raised her hand. "Staff Sergeant Mitchell, is it true that you're the most accurate sniper in military history?" Sarah looked at her directly. "No," she said. "I'm the most documented sniper in military history. There's a difference." She began walking across the front of the classroom, making eye contact with each recruit. A sniper is not about being the best shot. A sniper is about precision in decision-making. It's about understanding that every action has consequences that ripple outward in ways you can't always predict. You will be asked to take lives. That's what this training is designed to prepare you for. But before you can be trusted with that responsibility, I need to know that you understand what it costs. She paused in front of a desk and leaned against it. "My name is Sarah Mitchell. Most of you know that. Most of you know that I made a famous shot in Afghanistan. What you probably don't know is that I wake up at 3 in the morning most nights, drenched in sweat, hearing the sound of that shot. I know every detail of the man I killed. I know he had a family. I know that his death caused grief, just like the deaths he caused created grief. And I would do it again tomorrow, because the alternative was allowing more American soldiers to be killed." The young woman in the third row was watching her intently. "A sniper is the most honest weapon in warfare," Sarah continued. "You cannot hide behind propaganda. You cannot blame politicians or circumstances. You chose the shot. You pulled the trigger. You live with the consequences forever. The question before you is, are you ready for that? Because if you're here for glory, or if you're here because you think you're some kind of ultimate warrior, you need to leave now. This job will destroy you. This job will remake you into something your family won't fully recognize. This job will cost you something that money can't replace." She returned to the front of the classroom. "But if you're here because you understand that precision matters, if you're here because you want to protect people, if you're here because you've already accepted that you might have to do terrible things for necessary reasons, then we can work together." The training was identical to what Sarah had endured 3 years earlier. The same physical punishment, the same mental trials, the same pressure designed to break people and see if they could function while broken. But Sarah brought something different to the instruction. She brought honesty. When candidates struggled with the ballistics calculations, she didn't simply provide answers. She explained the philosophy. Every variable matters because lives depend on your precision. The difference between a hit and a miss at 2,000 meters might be 2 miles per hour of wind that you didn't account for. That 2-mile-per-hour difference might be the difference between preventing an attack and missing your target. Get comfortable with the idea that perfection is the minimum acceptable standard. When candidates reached the live-fire exercises at extreme range, she stood beside them and talked them through the psychological state they needed to achieve. Your mind will want to think about everything: your fear, your doubt, your family, why you're here. Quiet all of that. Become something simpler. Become an instrument that gathers data and responds to that data without emotion. Become a ghost. But she also did something that Master Sergeant Hayes hadn't done with her. She talked about the cost. After a particularly brutal training exercise, she pulled a candidate aside. A man named Stevens who demonstrated exceptional technical skill, but also showed signs of the kind of aggression that suggested he might become the wrong type of weapon. "You're good," she told him. "You have the talent for this, but I'm concerned about something. I think you enjoy the idea of killing. I think that concerns me. There's a difference between being willing to kill and wanting to kill. The first is a soldier, the second is a problem." Stevens tried to deny it, but Sarah just looked at him. "You don't have to answer, but I want you to think about it. Because if you go through with this, you're going to make decisions that will follow you for the rest of your life. And if you're the type of person who enjoys making those decisions, you need to find a different career." Stevens didn't recycle. He stayed in the program, but something in his attitude changed. The aggression modulated into something more controlled. By graduation, he'd become the kind of soldier Sarah could respect, capable, disciplined, and appropriately horrified by what he was capable of. The young woman with hungry eyes, her name was Catherine, graduated in the top 3 of her class. Like Sarah, she was the only woman in her cohort. Like Sarah, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd already proven herself in 100 invisible ways. On the day of graduation, Catherine approached Sarah after the ceremony. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "The shot?" Sarah recognized the question. It was the same question Rodriguez had asked her 3 years earlier. It was the question every sniper eventually asked themselves. "Every single day," Sarah said, "and I'd do it again tomorrow." Catherine nodded slowly. "The media keeps calling you a hero." "The media doesn't understand," Sarah said. "They've created a narrative that makes it easier for them to tell the story. The reality is much messier. The reality is that I did something necessary, and it cost me something I can never get back. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life figuring out how to carry that cost without letting it destroy me." "Will you teach again?" Catherine asked. Sarah looked at this young woman who reminded her so much of herself. "Yes," she said, "I'll keep teaching. Because if I'm going to carry this weight, I might as well try to make sure the next generation understands what they're getting into. I might as well try to create soldiers who are thoughtful about the responsibility they're carrying. Maybe that's the only way to make the cost mean something." Years later, when journalists asked Sarah Mitchell about her legacy, she would always redirect the conversation. "Legacy implies that I did something extraordinary," she would say. "What I did was execute my training under extreme circumstances. I was good at a difficult job. That's not legacy. That's just competence." But in the quiet moments, when she was alone on the roof of her barracks, watching the sun set over the Georgia landscape, she understood something different. Her legacy wasn't the impossible shot. Her legacy was the soldiers she trained who went on to make their own impossible shots, who went on to save lives, who went on to carry the weight with dignity and purpose. She'd been transformed by warfare, and now she was transforming others, passing on not just technical skills, but the wisdom earned through sacrifice. She was the phantom, not because she was unseen, but because she'd learned to exist in the spaces between humanity and instrument, and she was teaching others to find their own balance in that terrible, necessary space. The legend was real, but it was much smaller, much quieter, and much more human than anyone understood. And that was exactly as it should be.
Hai capito? Demonino, grazie ancora per la sabbetta, Patto, per il 14° mese, sei un tesoro. Sono a casa, oggi si deve uscire alle 11, figurati se fa... Ah, sì, è vero, l'ho letto che avevi giusto 2 ore di supplenza e uscivi alle 11. Hai fatto bene, tesoro, hai fatto bene, lo sai, ti dico di sì anch'io in questi casi. Anche se saresti andato a scuola per farti 2 ore di supplenza che chiacchieravi con gli altri, e poi uscivi prima, non era neanche una brutta idea oggi andare a scuola, patata. Un po' come oggi io, che volevo non streamare perché volevo guardarmi mappa. Ve lo dico molto sinceramente, ve lo dico molto sinceramente, eh. Sentite, io vi voglio bene, amo il fatto che voi mi vogliate bene e che siete qua e non voglio assolutamente cercare di mandarvi via, assolutamente, ma io oggi avevo altri piani. Io oggi avevo altri piani. Io oggi avevo altri... Guarda che bello. Guarda che bello. Guarda che bello. Cosa fate? Cosa fate? Cosa fate? Cosa fate? Guarda che bello. Guarda che bello. Cosa fate le sub qui? Cosa... Un treno della community? Cos'è un treno della community? Lasciami in pace, Twitch. Guarda che bello. Dai, guardate, non mi posso neanche concentrare sul resto. Niente, non posso vivere, non posso vivere. Non posso vivere. Buongiorno Davidino, sei bello come il sole. Sono a caso ci stai uscire? Sì, sì, pistrelo, perfetto. Davidino sei stato patatato. Sono contento che stai un po' meglio. Patatino, fammi sapere se ti riprendi del tutto. Para! Para, buongiorno. Cos'è il treno della community? Ma che treno avete fatto partire? Treno della community, raggiungi il livello 2 per sbloccare... Sì, ma questa è la solita cosa. Ma non capisco cosa... Ah, forse perché sblocca la roba a tutti? Non so cosa sia, l'ho visto in sti giorni in giro. Guarda che bell'azzurro. Ora prendo una K47 e vengo a trovarti su Ark. Perfetto, perfetto, demonino. Patato, sì. Sì, 14 metri sopra il cielo, sì. Il cielo di Berlino, il cielo azzurro di questo trenino azzurro, sì. Grazie, cuccioli, siete dei tesori, arrivo, eh. Bene, bene, come abbastanza soddisfatta. Sono contento per il... Ecco, questo era quello che volevo sentire, per quello te lo chiedevo. Volevo sentire se tu fossi soddisfatta, chi se ne frega poi com'è andato. Poi ieri sera ho mangiato un botto, non sono riuscito a dormire chissà quanto. Vabbè, avevi già scelto ieri sera, Ire, per piacere, su. E non sei riuscito a svegliarmi alle 6. Ire, avevi deciso di non andare a scuola ieri alle 11, su. Cucciolo, para, scamindo. Hai visto che invece siamo qui? Ma perché oggi non lavori, patato? Tesoro, grazie per il 13° mese. Grazie per la sub, cucciolo, grazie per la sub, grazie tesoro, ti ringrazio per la tua fiducia rinnovata in questo canale, per la tua fiducia rinnovata in tutto l'amore che io vi porto e che, che voi importate. Sì, sì, Demonino sei bello come il sole, ricordatelo sempre, ricordati sempre che io ti abbraccio forte, non ho mai fatto bet con nessuno se non con te. Mm? Grazie, patati, siete dei tesori. No, no, il tedesco no. Ah, non sai parlare il tedesco? Loro parlano italiano. Ah, loro parlano italiano, ho capito. Demonio è stato patatato, tesoro. Ah, loro parlano italiano. Vabbè, ma... Vabbè, ma è bello stare in famiglia, testi, su via. È bello quando ti si attaccano i bambini alle gambe.